Hello and welcome to the Neurospiritual Awakening podcast with Dr. Val. I am indeed Dr. Val. I am your host. This episode has been a long time coming, and it seems like every time there's a Mercury retrograde, it takes me 3 weeks to upload an episode. That's not exactly the case because my last episode with the awesome Michael actually got published during Mercury retrograde. So I'm not going to blame that astrological aspect for my lack of performance, so to speak. However, I will say that in this week, like we're Thursday, December 4th at the time of recording. Now this week, this first week of December, I have been just run down, bodily aches, all sorts of like flu symptoms without an actual flu. So, you know what? It's numerological week 4. And just like I said in my collaborative podcast called Frequency and Figures, which, by the way, if you haven't already checked out, you definitely should. I said week 4, as in numerologically speaking, and in this week, you will deal with anything that is out of integrity, that does not stand on strong foundations. So obviously for me, that was being not rested. And, you know, my body forced me to rest this week. Literally, I was in bed most of the week and we're Thursday afternoon. So there you have it. That prediction or forecast came true. Again, if you haven't checked out that podcast, we deliver a monthly energy and um, numerology forecast because that's one of my passions, as you know, alongside neuroscience, of course. But this episode is a solo episode, and if you've heard my other solo episodes, you will know that they're very much neuroscientifically oriented, and this will be no different. So in this episode, I want to talk about, or I am going to talk about rather, lived experience versus theoretical knowledge, just because this is something that I've touched on in the previous episode with Michael, right? We were talking about, if you haven't listened to that, again, go back and listen to it. But we were talking about how important it is nowadays to work with people who have had or are having a lived experience of whatever it is that you're experiencing. For example, as a coach, as a support person, as a fellow human being, I find value in supporting the people that I'm talking to by relating to them at the level of the experience rather than saying, hey, I've got a PhD in neuroscience, this is what's happening in your brain. And of course, we could talk about that because that is my area of expertise. In addition to, I've actually experienced this, what you're dealing with. I've experienced a relationship that's gone that way, or I've experienced the loss of someone, or I've experienced this grief, and literally, as human beings, all we want is for another to get us, or to be gotten by another. And this quality quality of having lived experience really adds to our capacity to do that, to literally wrap our arms, literally or metaphorically speaking, around another human when they're dealing with something, if we want to support them, okay? And if you're like me and listening to this, you're likely to be one of those wonderful human beings who are here to uplift other human beings and support them if they are a request for it. Okay. So let's talk about the neuroscience of this lived experience thing versus theories. Yeah. So we're all familiar with the standard educational model. I definitely am, where we get to read a lot, go to lectures, look at some theories, whether they're scientific, philosophical, or whatnot, listen to people's advice, certain concepts, insights. Yeah. That knowledge is processed by the brain through this upper layer or upper frontal layer called the prefrontal cortex. I've mentioned this before. because the prefrontal cortex is kind of like the CEO of your brain. It supports your decision-making process, your sense of self, higher order functions, so to speak. And it also allows you to regulate your emotions because it's intricately connected to the limbic system, which is the emotional center of your brain. Now, this traditional learning model where you're just theorizing, okay, it's all blah, blah, blah. It happens mainly or is processed mainly by the prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking brain. Yeah. It's really great to use the prefrontal cortex to understand ideas, to organize them, to form some sort of decisions. However, the connections, right? This is where neuroplasticity comes to into play. um, Neurochemically speaking, the connections that get formed when we are simply learning theory are very weak, all right? Basically, theory does not create strong or lasting neural connections, right? Which means that you're likely to forget this stuff pretty quick, unless it's on repeat over and over and over again. And I find with things like, actually having a PhD in something, I've theorized, but also got my hands dirty on a particular subject, neuroscience or behavioral neuroscience, for a long time. And that repetition is what allows us to strengthen those newly formed connections. So yes, okay, you can repeat shit over and over and over again in order to remember it and form or strengthen those neural pathways. Nonetheless, it's still very limiting and it may require a lot of repetition. Okay. So the prefrontal cortex, great thing, processes this theoretical knowledge, but is limited in that the neural pathways or connections formed through this type of learning do not last, ultimately, do not last unless fortified with endless repetition, which, is batshit boring. Okay. So that's my spiel on theoretical knowledge and how or at least one brain area that's involved in that, primarily involved in that being the prefrontal cortex. Now, lived experience, okay? Some people call this embodiment or emotional learning, all right? This lived experience actually activates our emotional centers. So, not to say that theoretical knowledge can't do that. And if you've done the neuroplasticity epigenetics course with me, you know that I say in order to strengthen a neural pathway or a memory, you add an emotion to it, okay? However, it's much easier when that's done as per lived or that is experienced during your livelihood. So let's say you're learning how to ride a bike, and that first time you catch balance, there's this kind of aha, or, this epiphany, this euphoric moment of joy. And now that memory of you learning how to ride a bike, I still remember one that happened to me because that emotion was present, that memory, those neural pathways are very much strongly entangled. Okay. And when you do experience, let's say, grief, things like trauma, this is the basis of PTSD and everything, is you experience these strong emotions. Or let's say you go through a divorce or a separation, most people have, and it's not a pleasant experience by any means. However, the range and the depth of emotions that are experienced throughout that or during that time strengthens the learnings, or the learning, the theoretical knowledge that you may have um, put to use at the time. Okay, so this is literally emotions fortifying theory or knowledge. Another thing that happens during lived experience is social connection and social interaction, amazing for the brain and amazing for causing and strengthening neuroplasticity or the growth and solidification of new neural pathways. All right. Lived experience also promotes neuroplasticity by, well, opening up something new, opening you up to something new in your life, okay? It could be a challenge, may not be something that's nice. Nonetheless, it's new, and novelty causes neuroplasticity. So the growth and then strengthening of neural pathways. Okay, the recording stopped there for a second, but here we go again. Lived experience is advantageous because it allows for, or it engages our emotional processing centers. So the limbic system, which comprises the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, amongst other brain areas, okay? But it also, lived experience also engages a lot of neurochemicals, like dopamine or epinephrine. So these things further strengthen the connections or the wiring within your brain when you have that experience so that it's easily accessible to your brain afterwards. Again, I gave the example of riding a bike or going through separation or um, a major emotionally charged event, whether it was positive or not in your life, okay, that'll have that memory stick, okay? So if we're talking about living life and supporting others, whether you're coaching, teaching, or just being there for another human being, the value of lived experience is that it's just easily accessible to your brain from this from your whole self, if you will. All right. Um, Now, one other aspect of theoretical knowledge that I want to talk about is that it actually doesn't really, it by itself, theory doesn't really change anything or doesn't cause positive change. Yes, knowledge is power, that's true, but different kinds of knowledge, including lived experience, yeah? Theory in and of itself, that's why things like PhDs, for example, a PhD in neuroscience has, yeah, some part of it is theory. Like I did a couple courses at uni, like theoretical courses, lectures that I went to. But predominantly for 4+ years, I was in the lab doing things, experiments. Yeah, literally experiencing, experimenting. And hence, I am an expert in that field because I physically did all of that and experienced and went through the emotions of it. So it's like ingrained in my body, in my mind, in my brain, and of course, repetition, and did it over and over and over again. So um, it makes one, a PhD ultimately makes one a master of the field, yeah, or an expert in the field. Okay. So another experience would be knowing that mindfulness and meditation is good for you isn't actually going to make your life better. You have to go on and practice it, just like anything else. Or knowing that trauma really fucks your brain and disconnects the prefrontal cortex from the rest of your brain, so you can't regulate your emotion. Knowing that, okay, is empowering, but in addition to actually experiencing that and practicing to reconnect the two in whatever form of therapy that you're doing. Hopefully, it's not just talk therapy, because this whole time I've been saying theoretical knowledge doesn't actually cause change. Okay? Concepts don't change reality. It's embodiment, lived experience that does so. Let's say, is there anything else I wanted to say about that? Look, not really. Not really. I think I've said the most of it. I mean, if you really want to get even more nitty-gritty about the kind of emotional processing that goes on when an experience actually occurs, is the amygdala, which is like an almond-shaped structure, deeply rooted or seated within your brain, which is part of the limbic system. It tags an event with an emotion, okay, to make that event occur as important to your brain. right? And this ultimately boosts long-term memory formation in the hippocampus, which is the memory storing or the memory storage of your brain. And it sits right next to the amygdala, funnily enough. So, of course, when there's an emotionally charged event, as I said, it could be something like learning how to ride a bike or going through a divorce, yeah, distinct events nonetheless, that big emotion that you feel or experience during that occurrence is what makes that memory stick and makes it easily accessible to you further down the line. All right. All right. Well, hopefully I haven't bored you too much with the nitty-gritty neuroscience of it, but I thought it would be important to talk about lived experience and why it is valued and it is in fact distinct from just theoretical knowledge. All right? Theoretical knowledge is great when you've had the experience, and then you can learn to understand, like, what happened in my brain, or what happened ontologically, or what happened spiritually. But talking about it only does so much. Living through it, completely different, as we just said, at the level of your brain, and I haven't even talked about the rest of the body. Okay? And that's why things like, you have sometimes, for those of you who've had let's say, a psychic reading, right? You have a psychic reading, and then ultimately the person, or you yourself may have done like a card spread, right? There's some knowledge that you're accessing, right? That is given to you through spirit, the person that's doing the reading or whatever. But again, that's theory. And when it comes to, let's say you've had a prediction, right? Oh, something's going to happen. You know that that's going to happen now. But it never actually feels the same when it does come to pass, right? Because of lived experience. Like, you experiencing the thing that you were foretold was going to happen is not the same thing as when you were told that it was going to happen. That's why sometimes you're like, oh, I'm pissed. I don't know. That really didn't happen the way that I thought it would. Yeah, because lived experience is different. Alrighty, well, hopefully you've enjoyed this little episode by yours truly. Again, a little reminder that I've started an awesome collaborative podcast with Stacia Jeanette, aka Oracle V, and you can find us on YouTube at Frequency and Figures, where we deliver a monthly forecast on the energies and the numerology of the month. And then we live through it and we talk about what happened in the next podcast or the next episode. So we do this monthly. It's pretty fun. I hope you get to enjoy it. Again, if you want to work with me, just reach out. My website, email, you've got all that in the show notes below. Until I will see you next time. Thank you for supporting me. Thank you for listening to this. Thank you for having this make a difference in your life. Lots of love. Au revoir.